The young woman was known throughout her village not for wealth or power, but for a kind of quiet light that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Her hair fell in long, soft waves that shimmered under the sun, catching the golden rays like threads of light. Her skin was smooth, touched with the warmth of youth, and her eyes held a gentle curiosity, always observing, always noticing the needs of others. Children adored her, often running to her with scraped knees or small grievances, and she would kneel without complaint, offering soft words and gentle hands to soothe them. Even the elders, who had lived long and hardened lives, found comfort in her presence. Her laughter was a rare thing, light and musical, capable of lifting the heaviest hearts. Her kindness was matched only by her humility. She would not boast of her abilities in weaving or her skill with herbs. She would quietly leave baskets of fresh vegetables at the homes of those who struggled, or mend clothes left torn by the wear of time. People spoke of her softly, often in admiration, but admiration quickly twisted into jealousy. Among her own family, whispers circulated. Her stepsisters muttered as she passed, their tongues sharp with envy. "Why does she receive praise for the simplest deeds?" they hissed. "Why do the elders smile when she walks by and not when we work as hard?" Even her mother, though outwardly proud, found herself comparing their accomplishments silently, her heart twisting with an unease she could not name. It was not only her beauty or her deeds that drew attention, but her spirit. In a village where competition for status and recognition was subtle yet fierce, her gentle manner and calm courage made her stand out. When disputes arose, it was her voice that often mediated, soft yet firm, guiding neighbors to reconciliation. Her ability to remain composed in chaos, to see the good even in the envious or unkind, created a mirror in which others saw their own flaws. Some villagers found this infuriating, unable to tolerate a presence so effortlessly admirable. Rumors began to stir, quiet at first. She was too perfect, perhaps too cunning in hiding it, perhaps a spirit disguised as a girl. These murmurs gained traction among those whose pride or selfishness could not bear the contrast of her purity. Despite this, she remained unaware of the growing malice. She rose each day to tend to her chores and to help those in need, her heart untouched by the grudges that quietly festered around her. The village children continued to flock to her side, their laughter trailing in her wake, bringing smiles to her own face as she taught them small lessons about life, about patience, about kindness. Even in the market, she would pause to assist the elderly in carrying heavy bundles, or offer a smile to strangers who had wandered too far from their homes. Her actions were never performative, they flowed naturally, and this authenticity made her an even brighter light in the midst of envy. As days turned into weeks, her reputation grew. Traders passing through spoke of the girl with awe, describing her as a spirit of the village, someone whose presence was a blessing in human form. Yet the jealousy of kin and neighbors deepened in shadowed corners. Stepsisters plotted subtle schemes, spilling water on her path, hiding her tools, whispering slander to others who admired her. Villagers who once smiled upon her acts now exchanged nervous glances, uncertain whether their admiration was safe or whether it would draw unwanted attention from the envious. The contrast between her innocence and the encroaching malice created a tension that was almost palpable, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Her life, simple yet extraordinary in its virtue, became the fulcrum of both admiration and hatred. Every gentle deed was noticed, every smile measured, and every whispered envy plotted. She walked unaware of the danger building silently around her, carrying only her kindness, her courage, and her unwavering spirit. She could not yet know that the very qualities which made her loved, which drew warmth and light, were also the ones that would provoke the cruelty of others, pushing her toward a trial that would test every fiber of her being. Even as she laughed with the children or tended the sick, the first seeds of betrayal were taking root. Eyes watched her from darkened corners, hearts hardened by envy, plotting how to claim her place or diminish her radiance. Her innocence and goodness, which had been her shield among the young and the old, were powerless against the quiet, determined malice building in the shadows. She moved through the village as if untouched by these currents, her gentle spirit shining all the brighter for it, unaware that soon she would be forced to confront the darkness others had been cultivating in secret. By the time the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky with hues of gold and crimson, she remained unbroken, her smile intact, her heart still open. Yet the world around her had begun to change, the envy swelling like clouds ready to burst, and her journey toward both suffering and transformation was quietly set into motion, carried forward by the very innocence that had defined her life to that point. The storm had been gathering for hours, though the villagers did not notice, absorbed as they were in their petty rivalries and quiet envy. The young woman, whose life had been a constant thread of kindness and care, now found herself the target of cruelty that had been building like a pressure-filled cloud. It started with hushed whispers behind closed doors, hands pointed subtly, eyes narrowed in suspicion, and murmurs that she had somehow angered the spirits, or that her beauty and innocence were dangerous to others. These accusations, though baseless, spread like wildfire, fanning the embers of fear and malice. Her stepsisters were the first to act. One afternoon, while the sky darkened with the promise of rain, they lured her to a secluded part of the village under the guise of gathering herbs for a meal. They whispered carefully rehearsed lies in the ears of the villagers who followed, that she had stolen something sacred, that she had mocked the elders, that she had spoken ill of those who now watched her with thinly veiled suspicion. The elders, who once smiled at her presence, now frowned and shook their heads gravely, their expressions weighted with judgment. They had been swayed by the careful words of her envious kin, and they joined the villagers in condemning her. The girl, innocent and bewildered, pleaded her case. Her voice, soft yet firm, tried to pierce the veil of suspicion, but it fell on deaf ears. No one came to her defense. The children she had cared for hid behind their mother's skirts, too afraid to speak out. Even though she had helped in secret, the quiet farmers and artisans who had once smiled at her passing, averted their gaze, unwilling to challenge the growing consensus. The realization struck her sharply. She had been abandoned not by strangers, but by the very people who should have protected and guided her. Her heart ached with betrayal, the sting of isolation mingling with the rising fear of what was to come. By the time the first heavy drops began to fall, the decision had been made. The elders decreed that she must be punished, left to face the storm alone as penance for the crime she had not committed. The villagers, driven by envy and a twisted sense of justice, carried her to the edge of the forest. Her clothes, once neat and carefully cared for, were torn in the struggle, and her hair clung to her damp face, slick with rain. The first drops hit her skin, cold and biting, and she shivered, the chill pressing against her vulnerability. Her stepsisters stood at the boundary, faces pale but triumphant, smirking as the wind picked up and scattered her words into the tempest. "Perhaps the spirits will punish you now," one whispered, her tone dripping with satisfaction. The villagers turned their backs, retreating to the safety of their homes, leaving her alone in the growing storm. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the sharp tang of rain-soaked clay. She called out, but no one returned her voice. Her cries were swallowed by the storm, mingling with the sound of thunder and the pounding of rain against the ground. She stumbled through the mud, her bare feet sinking into the soft, waterlogged soil. Each step was a struggle, her arms reaching out blindly for support, for something to hold on to, anything to shield her from the elements and the weight of her despair. Her heart pounded, not only from fear of the storm but from the realization of human cruelty. The very people she had trusted and loved had abandoned her to this fate. The rain was unrelenting, drenching her, chilling her bones, and stripping away any comfort she might have drawn from her familiar surroundings. As the storm intensified, the girl felt her strength waver. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the twisted faces of trees and the dark, empty paths ahead. The wind tore at her clothing, whipping her hair across her face, blinding her, and making each step a trial against both nature and the cruelty of men and women she had once called family. The isolation pressed on her like a physical weight. She realized that no one would come for her, no one would intervene. This was the moment she understood the depth of human malice, and the fragility of her position. Yet even in the depths of betrayal, something stirred within her, a quiet, resolute spark. The girl's eyes, wide and fearful, began to harden with the first glimmers of determination. Though she was abandoned, though the storm sought to break her, her spirit did not yield entirely. The cruelty of the villagers, the calculated envy of her kin, had placed her at the mercy of the elements, but it had also revealed a truth she could not ignore. She could no longer rely on others. Survival would be hers alone, and the storm, she sensed, might offer both challenge and awakening. As the rain poured down, soaking her to the skin, the first whispers of wind and water seemed almost to answer her unspoken prayers. The betrayal had left her alone, yes, but it had also opened the door to a power beyond mere human reach. Her heart trembled, but it did not break entirely. She had been cast out, left to the storm, but the rain itself, relentless and indifferent, began to speak in ways only she could sense. The night was hers to endure, and in that endurance, the first threads of vengeance and transformation began to weave themselves into the fabric of her being. The rain came suddenly, a curtain of cold, relentless drops that hammered the earth and soaked the young woman to the bone. It began as a few hesitant splashes from the darkened sky, almost playful, teasing her as she staggered through the mud, but within moments, it escalated into a downpour, fierce and unyielding. Thunder rolled across the hills like the growl of some great beast, each crash vibrating through the ground beneath her feet, shaking the very air and echoing in her chest. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the forest's edge in brief, blinding flashes, revealing twisted shadows of trees that seemed alive and menacing. She stumbled blindly, her bare feet slipping in the slick mud, her wet clothes clinging to her, cutting her movements. The cold bit through her skin, stealing warmth, sapping strength, and leaving her shivering with a despair that ran deeper than mere discomfort. Her eyes searched desperately for shelter, for some sign of refuge, but the village was gone behind her, swallowed by shadows and rain. The paths she had once walked with ease were now treacherous, turned to rivers of mud and water, and the familiar landmarks had become alien under the storm's fury. The wind tore at her hair, whipping it across her face, lashing at her arms and pulling at her drenched clothing. She called out, voice cracking, but the rain swallowed her words instantly, scattering them into the storm's chaos. No response came, no comforting figure emerged from the trees. She was utterly alone, abandoned not only by her kin but by the comforting constancy of her home. Each step became a battle against nature itself. Her muscles ached from slipping and struggling through the thickening mud, and every motion brought the risk of falling, of being swept away by the sudden currents forming along the sloped earth. Rain filled her mouth and nose when she gasped, stinging her eyes and blurring her vision further. Yet the fear was not merely physical, it was the suffocating awareness of isolation, the realization that she had been forsaken, left to endure the storm with nothing to shield her. Her mind raced, imagining the whispers of the villagers who had abandoned her, picturing their faces mocking her plight, their envy now realized in her suffering. As the hours stretched on, the storm intensified. Branches, heavy with water, snapped and fell, striking the ground with deafening crashes. The sky itself seemed alive, its anger mirrored in the wind's furious howls. The girl sought to shelter beneath a tree, pressing her back against its trunk, but even there the rain soaked her through, dripping from leaves and pooling around her knees. The mud threatened to pull her down, to swallow her entirely if she rested too long. Each heartbeat carried both fatigue and terror, the two mingling until her spirit wavered. Yet even in her despair, her mind held on to the faintest flicker of hope. The storm, though merciless, had not yet taken everything. Night fell and with it the storm grew even more formidable. Thunderclaps split the air, shaking loose small stones and debris from the hillside, and lightning illuminated the jagged landscape in fleeting, horrifying glimpses. She could feel the forest around her pulsating with power, trees bending under the wind's assault, streams swelling into torrents that threatened to carry her away. Each moment of exposure to the elements was a lesson in fear and resilience. Her body ached, her skin burned with cold, and her limbs trembled from exhaustion. Every step forward was a triumph, yet it was also a reminder of her vulnerability and isolation. Despite the overwhelming force of nature, a subtle awareness began to awaken within her. The rain, relentless and unyielding, seemed to move around her in unusual patterns. Gusts of wind swirled not entirely at random, and puddles seemed to ripple in anticipation of her movements. She sensed a strange rhythm in the storm, a silent acknowledgement of her presence. Though her body was weak, her spirit, sharp with pain and betrayal, began to notice that the elements themselves were listening. The realization offered a strange, faint comfort amidst the terror. She was not entirely powerless. The storm raged through the night, and she endured it as best she could, cold and wet, shivering yet moving forward. She felt the first stirrings of something beyond human, a connection to the rain that was relentless, vast and alive. It began to whisper, almost imperceptibly, among the thunderclaps and pelting drops, hinting that the world she had once known was giving way to something far larger, and that her suffering might yet transform into a force she could wield. Alone, exhausted, and soaked to the skin, she faced the storm head-on, the first seeds of strength and supernatural potential forming even in the coldest, darkest hours of despair. The rain continued without mercy, drumming against the forest floor like a relentless drumbeat, but as the young woman struggled through the mud and water, she began to notice subtle anomalies. At first, it was almost imperceptible, the way the wind seemed to shift around her, curling and bending in unnatural patterns. It did not merely blow, it seemed to whisper. Faintly at first, she thought she might be imagining it, but soon the words became clearer, carried in the sibilant hiss of the gusts. "Fear not, move forward, do not falter," the wind seemed to say. Her heart stuttered at the sensation, disbelief mingling with a flicker of hope. She paused, glancing around the dense forest, searching for a source, but the trees swayed violently under the storm, no creature visible, no human in sight. Yet the words persisted, growing louder, insistent but gentle, urging her onward. Water moved oddly beneath her feet. Puddles rippled even when she had not touched them, as though they were alive, conscious of her presence. Streams changed course subtly, guiding her away from treacherous roots and hidden pits, carrying her closer to safety without her realizing it. The river, swollen with rain, formed an almost protective barrier, diverting itself to shield rather than sweep her away. She stumbled through mud and rain, and the sensation of being watched grew stronger, a strange warmth crawling along her spine. She dared to lift her gaze toward the stormy sky, and in the flashes of lightning she saw birds circling high above. They were not merely flying in random flocks. They seemed deliberate, hovering over her, swooping in coordinated arcs as if patrolling her path, guardians in feathered form. The girl's breath came in shuddering gasps, cold and wet, yet her mind raced with awe and fear. The elements themselves appeared to respond to her presence, whispering in the language of storms, water, and wind. Every gust of air that brushed her cheeks carried reassurance, each ripple of water a guide. Even the birds' cries had a strange cadence, almost like chants or warnings, echoing through the chaos of the tempest. She could feel the pulse of the forest, the rhythm of the rain, the heartbeat of the wind, all aligned in ways that defied ordinary perception. The storm was no longer a mere danger, it was a living entity, and she had somehow entered its awareness. As the minutes stretched into hours, the young woman became increasingly aware of the connection. The wind would press against her back, pushing her away from hidden hazards. Water would rise in small, controlled waves, preventing her from slipping into deeper pits or marshes. Even the mud beneath her feet seemed to soften when she needed to step carefully and firm up when she needed balance. Birds circled ever closer, their keen eyes reflecting in brief flashes of lightning, a silent escort guiding her through the tempest. She marveled at this strange symbiosis, a mixture of terror and wonder coursing through her veins. In quieter moments between the thunderclaps, she began to hear more than just encouragement. The wind carried images, fleeting glimpses of paths, hidden clearings, and places of relative safety. It was as though the storm itself was offering counsel, teaching her to navigate its chaos, to move not only with caution but with a growing awareness of its rhythm. Each flash of lightning illuminated the world in stark contrast, revealing details she had never noticed. The bend of a branch that could pierce her skin, a sudden depression in the earth that could swallow her ankle, a hidden thornbed ready to tear through her clothing and flesh. The rain was no longer a mere adversary, it had become a mentor, guiding her with invisible hands. Her heart began to steady. Fear still laced her veins, but it was tempered by a dawning realization: she was not alone in this storm. Something larger, something alive and conscious, had taken notice of her plight. This force, whether divine, elemental, or supernatural, seemed to protect her, to watch over her in ways that made the wind's whispers and the birds' flights coherent and meaningful. Every motion around her, the swirl of water, the bending of trees, the dance of birds, was orchestrated with purpose, all in service of guiding, guarding, and perhaps preparing her for what lay ahead. By the time the rain began to ease slightly, the girl felt a strange calm settling over her, a sense that she was no longer merely a victim of circumstance. The storm had spoken in subtle signs and whispered guidance, and she had understood, even if only partially. The forest, the water, the wind, and the birds had revealed themselves as allies, silent and vigilant. The elements themselves were aligned with her survival, a force larger than human malice or cruelty, watching, protecting, and waiting for the moment when her strength would match theirs. She moved forward with renewed determination, wet and cold but no longer helpless, aware that she was no longer simply at the mercy of the storm. Somewhere deep within the wind, the water, and the circling birds, a presence had taken notice of her innocence, of her endurance, and perhaps, of the wrath that had yet to come. The rain continued to pour, unrelenting and fierce, yet something had shifted. No longer did it feel purely punishing. Instead, each drop that soaked her through seemed to carry a strange, invigorating energy. At first, she thought it a trick of the mind, an illusion born from desperation and exhaustion. But as the rain drummed against her skin, a warmth began to spread beneath the cold, small at first, then growing steadily, wrapping around her chest and limbs. It was as if the storm itself had recognized her suffering and had chosen to give her strength in return. Her body, chilled and trembling moments before, now felt enlivened, as though the water carried a hidden vitality that seeped directly into her bones. She lifted her arms slightly, letting the rain run down them, and marveled at the sensation. There was a rhythm to it, a pulse that seemed synchronized with her own heartbeat. Each droplet became more than water. It was as though the storm was speaking to her, offering guidance, courage, and power. The fear that had weighed so heavily on her moments before was slowly replaced by a newfound awareness. She was not merely a victim of circumstance. This storm, violent and immense, was responding to her presence, lending her its own force, forging a bond between human and nature that transcended ordinary understanding. The realization stirred something deep within her spirit. Where she had felt helpless and abandoned, now there was clarity. The storm's energy seemed to flow through her veins, lifting the heaviness from her shoulders. Her muscles, previously stiff and aching from struggle, relaxed yet strengthened. The biting cold, once torturous, now carried a sharpness that honed her senses, making her more aware of the world around her. The shifting mud beneath her feet, the swaying branches, the distant cries of birds caught in the wind. Every sensation was heightened, every sound sharper, as if the storm had not only empowered her body but awakened her awareness to the hidden currents of the forest and the elements themselves. Lightning flashed across the sky, briefly illuminating the rain-soaked trees and the swirling river waters, and in that brilliance she noticed something extraordinary. The droplets around her seemed to shimmer unnaturally, refracting light in patterns that felt almost purposeful. It was no longer random. The rain's motion carried intention. When she took a careful step, the water seemed to part slightly before her, guiding her feet and protecting her from hidden hazards. The storm, relentless and overwhelming to anyone else, was bending itself subtly around her, acknowledging her presence and the purity of her spirit. As she continued forward, she realized the bond between herself and the storm went beyond mere survival. Her emotions, her fears, and her courage all resonated with the rhythm of the rain. When despair rose, the storm pressed harder, forcing her to confront her own vulnerability and transform it into strength. When she felt determination, the rain responded, swirling more fiercely, carrying an almost protective force that propelled her onward. Each flash of lightning illuminated not just the forest but her own resolve, reflecting the spark of power igniting inside her. The girl's perception changed. She no longer saw the storm as an enemy, a destructive force meant to punish, but as a companion, a teacher, and an ally. The wind seemed to whisper encouragement, the water carried her weight, and the rain's constant patter became a rhythmic chant, embedding itself into her very being. The storm was alive, aware, and it had chosen her as its ward. She began to move with purpose, no longer stumbling blindly, her steps measured and confident, attuned to the pulse of nature around her. By the time she paused to catch her breath, standing in the middle of a shallow stream, she understood a profound truth. She was no longer helpless. The rain had given her more than warmth or energy. It had granted her connection, empowerment, and a newfound sense of agency. With the storm as her ally, she could endure, she could survive, and one day perhaps she could even wield its fury in ways that would demand justice and respect. The girl lifted her face to the sky, rain soaking her hair and dripping from her chin, and for the first time she felt unafraid. The young woman stood in the heart of the storm, her body soaked and trembling, yet a new sensation coursed through her veins. It was no longer just fear or despair, something darker, sharper, and more potent had begun to stir. Her anguish, accumulated from betrayal, abandonment, and cruelty, began to crystallize into a quiet, simmering wrath. The storm around her seemed to recognize this shift, responding as though it were attuned to the rhythm of her heart. The wind howled with greater intensity, whipping her hair into a wild halo, carrying her whispered thoughts into the night. Each clap of thunder felt like an echo of her fury, and lightning seemed to follow the jagged contours of her emotions, illuminating not only the forest but the storm within her. Her eyes glinted with a strange light, reflecting flashes of the tempest that surrounded her. She felt a power growing within, intangible yet undeniable. It started subtly. Her movements were lighter, faster, as though the rain itself supported her. Then came the awareness that her thoughts could stir the elements. A furious thought, a pang of injustice, and the wind would curl more sharply around her. A silent demand for protection, and the river waters shifted to form small eddies that guided her steps. The storm had become more than a mere companion. It had become an extension of her spirit, a living, breathing force that mirrored and magnified her emotions. Her wrath was fueled by memories of cruelty. She remembered the mocking laughter of villagers as they had abandoned her, the envious eyes of kin who had whispered lies behind closed doors, the elder's cold, judgmental stares that had sealed her fate. The vivid recollections were like coals igniting the fire within her, each memory adding fuel to a growing inferno. Every scream of fear or scorn she had endured became a thread woven into the storm, an invisible cord linking her pain to the power that surged around her. She began to understand that the storm did not merely shelter her, it amplified her will, her rage, and her desire for reckoning. Lightning struck closer this time, splitting a tree mere yards from where she stood. The impact was deafening, and the flash of heat made her flinch momentarily, yet she realized she was untouched, shielded in some inexplicable way. It was as if the storm itself were teaching her the extent of its protection and the potential of the wrath she now wielded. The wind tugged at her, testing her focus, and she felt the first tingling awareness that she could shape the storm to her purpose, that the very forces of nature were responsive to the intensity of her emotions. She was no longer vulnerable, she was awakening into something far greater. With each heartbeat, her confidence grew. The storm mirrored her fury, rising in tandem with the intensity of her thoughts. Raindrops fell like spears, the thunder roared like the voices of the oppressed, and lightning danced in sync with her growing resolve. She began to sense a rhythm, a pulse that connected her breath, her emotions, and the chaotic symphony of the storm. In this connection she felt both exhilaration and danger, a delicate balance between harnessing the tempest and being consumed by it. Yet the raw power thrumming through her was intoxicating, a revelation that she had been more than victim from the very beginning, she had been a force waiting to awaken. Tension hung in the air, not only from the storm but from the awareness of what she was capable of. Every step she took through the flooded forest seemed to ripple with her presence. Birds circled closer, their cries now seeming to carry warnings, sensing her transformation. Branches bent more violently in her path, responding to her will, or perhaps her will bending to theirs. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, as though recognizing the birth of something unnatural and fearsome. The storm was no longer random chaos, it had become the conduit for her wrath, the vehicle through which she could enact the justice denied her. A surge of thought, sharp and unforgiving, flashed in her mind. Those who had abandoned her, those who had mocked her, those who had reveled in her suffering, they would pay. The storm responded immediately. Rain intensified, drumming harder on the leaves and ground. Lightning struck again, closer, illuminating the forest in bursts of brilliant white. The wind howled with ferocity, circling around her as if poised to act at her command. She could feel it waiting, pulsing with anticipation, a living extension of her wrath, ready to exact vengeance. As night deepened, the girl's transformation became undeniable. Her body, frail from exposure, now carried the aura of someone who had endured and emerged beyond mere human limitations. Her spirit, interwoven with the storm, glowed with a spectral energy, and her mind sharpened with the awareness that she could direct her newfound power. Each element, the wind, the rain, the lightning, responded to her emotional state, coiling with tension and bristling with potential energy. The forest, the storm, and her spirit were now one, poised at the precipice of a reckoning that would soon spill into the village that had wronged her. In the heart of the tempest she smiled faintly, wet and shivering, yet filled with a cold certainty. Anguish had become wrath, despair had become power, and the storm was no longer an adversary but a loyal companion. She had been cast into the darkness of rain and fear, and from that crucible, a force had been born, an elemental wrath, patient and poised, waiting for the moment to claim justice that had long been denied. The rain had become more than a simple downpour, it was alive, charged with the energy of the girl's wrath and the essence of her newfound power. Each drop seemed purposeful, falling in a rhythm that mirrored her heartbeat, striking her shoulders, her hair, her soaked clothing, yet never burdening her with weakness. As the wind whipped around her, bending the trees and sending rivers of water swirling through the forest floor, she felt it, a pull, a current of energy rising from the storm itself, beckoning her to accept what was hers by right. Her spirit, once crushed beneath betrayal and despair, now surged in resonance with the tempest. Then it began. A subtle shift first, almost imperceptible. The rain above her head seemed to pause, droplets hovering midair, suspended as if held by invisible threads. She lifted her gaze, squinting through the heavy downpour, and gasped. The droplets swirled, forming an intricate, luminous halo above her. The crown of rain shimmered, reflecting the intermittent flashes of lightning, refracting the storm's light into cascading arcs of silver and blue. It was as if the tempest itself had crowned her queen of its fury, marking her as something beyond ordinary humanity, a force of reckoning and power. The sensation was electrifying. She could feel the crown's energy flowing into her, the water moving in tandem with her thoughts, responding to her will. When she shifted slightly, the droplets above her spun faster, brightening in intensity. The wind seemed to wrap around her in a protective spiral, the trees bending in respect rather than obstruction, and the streams and puddles rearranged themselves subtly, creating clear paths where once the storm had sought to impede her. This crown was not just decoration, it was authority incarnate, the physical manifestation of her bond with the storm and her dominion over its elements. As she lifted her arms, testing the newfound connection, the rain responded immediately. Droplets leapt from the crown, forming arcs that mimicked her gestures, whipping across the forest with precision. When she imagined force, the water spun into sharp, cutting ribbons that sliced through the misty air. When she focused on protection, a dome of swirling rain formed around her, deflecting branches, mud, and debris as if they were mere illusions. She was no longer a helpless girl abandoned to nature's cruelty. She was the storm's mistress, her wrath and mercy mirrored in its every movement. Lightning cracked, closer than ever, and yet it did not strike her. Instead, it danced around the crown, accentuating its brilliance, feeding her power. The wind howled, bending to her intentions, circling and coiling in synchronization with her thoughts. The storm had become her instrument, the crown its emblem of unchallengeable authority. She could feel the connection deepening, each raindrop a conduit between her emotions and the tempest. When she concentrated on a feeling, fear, anger, sorrow, determination, the storm responded, amplifying that emotion across the forest, turning it into tangible energy. Her eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the storm's luminescence. Shadows of trees flickered across her drenched skin, but she did not fear them, they were part of her domain now. Every sound of thunder resonated with her heartbeat, every gust of wind mirrored the rising power within her. Birds circled above, their cries now synchronized with her intentions, their flight patterns responding to her focus. Even the river, swollen and wild, moved as though conscious, bending around her feet to form channels that followed her path. The storm's obedience was absolute, a reflection of the crown that marked her as its sovereign. As the night deepened, the full magnitude of her transformation became evident. She raised her hands and sheets of rain responded, whipping into spirals, forming walls of water that mirrored her movements. She could summon gusts that carried her forward, currents that lifted debris, or torrents that could redirect streams with a thought. The crown remained above her head, luminous and ever-present, a visible testament to the storm's allegiance. The wind seemed to whisper her name, and the lightning traced patterns in the clouds that spelled her dominion across the sky. She was no longer a victim, she was an unstoppable force, a living embodiment of wrath, justice, and elemental power. The forest trembled around her. The trees bent, water churned, and the birds' cries filled the storm with a new rhythm. Yet she stood serene, regal, commanding the chaos rather than being consumed by it. The betrayal and abandonment that had left her shivering and terrified were now distant memories, their sting transformed into the source of her strength. The crown of rain above her head was not just symbolic, it was the bond between her spirit and the storm, a mark of sovereignty, a warning to any who had ever wronged her. With a calm breath, she sensed the village in the distance, the people who had abandoned and humiliated her. She did not need to move yet. The crown, the storm, and her will were already aligned, ready to act when the moment demanded. Every raindrop, every gust of wind, and every bolt of lightning responded to her inner fire. She was the storm's chosen, the rightful heir of its fury, and the rain had crowned her not just in appearance but in absolute, unstoppable power. The young woman emerged from the edge of the forest, her figure partially obscured by sheets of rain that fell in relentless torrents. Yet even in the downpour, the crown of rain above her head gleamed like a living halo, droplets suspended in midair, catching every flash of lightning and refracting it into brilliant arcs of silver and blue. The storm itself seemed to bend toward her, winds swirling at her sides, branches bowing in obeisance, rivers parting subtly to mark her path. With each step, water rose in small eddies around her feet, as though the very earth recognized her presence and sought to carry her forward. Every movement radiated power and authority. She was no longer merely a girl, but an elemental force in human form, a living embodiment of nature's wrath. The village came into view shrouded in rain and mist. The houses, usually warm and welcoming, now appeared small, fragile, and exposed beneath the overwhelming fury of the storm. From within, faint lights flickered as villagers peeked nervously through soaked curtains and half-open doors, unaware of what approached. A chill passed through the air, carrying with it whispers of unease that had nothing to do with the weather. The sound of her steps on mud and flooded pathways was almost drowned by the storm's roar, yet somehow, it carried a weight that made every villager who heard it tense. Something unnatural, something unrelenting was coming, and instinctively they knew it was tied to the girl they had betrayed. Her eyes scanned the village and she felt no hesitation, only purpose. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating her crown in brilliant flashes and casting long, wavering shadows that stretched toward the trembling villagers. Wind tugged at her drenched clothing and whipped her hair around her face, yet it did not disturb her. It moved as though choreographed, protective and responsive to her will. Every drop of rain seemed aware of her intentions, forming walls, streams, and spirals around her path. The villagers, watching from doorways and windows, were struck dumb. They saw her clearly now, not the girl they had mocked or abandoned, but a being of terrifying majesty, her form wreathed in swirling water, crowned with the storm itself, and illuminated by flickering lightning. A low murmur spread through the crowd as fear began to replace disbelief. Mothers clutched children, elders dropped to trembling knees, and even the strongest men who had once cast her out could not hide the terror in their eyes. They whispered to one another, pointing at her crown, the unnatural swirl of water at her feet, the way the wind and rain seemed to obey her every movement. "It is she has returned," someone gasped, voice quivering. Another muttered, "The rain, it obeys her." Their words were barely audible above the storm, yet the young woman heard them all, felt the fear in each pulse of the village. She did not need to speak or move beyond her calm, deliberate steps. The storm itself conveyed the magnitude of her presence and the wrath she carried. As she drew closer, the villagers attempted to flee, but the storm subtly impeded them. Wind gusts directed fallen branches across narrow paths, flooding small ditches, turning the terrain into treacherous ground for those who sought escape. Lightning illuminated their faces in stark, brief flashes, revealing terror, guilt, and the realization that nothing they could do would hide them from her sight. Her footsteps, though measured, seemed heavier than reality, pressing fear into the mud with every step. Water at her feet swirled in unnatural patterns, coiling around anyone foolish enough to step too close, not harming them yet but signaling the force ready to obey her command. The village dogs barked and whimpered, sensing the presence of something otherworldly. Birds took to the sky, cawing in alarm, circling above the crown that crowned her head, their cries mixing with the roar of the storm to create a symphony of warning. Even the trees seemed to lean toward her, bending with recognition of power, branches brushing over the rooftops as if to guard her path or to warn the villagers of her unstoppable presence. Every element of nature was aligned with her, ready to obey the intent that pulsed like electricity through her veins. She walked deliberately to the center of the village, the crown glowing brighter with every step, lightning dancing around her in chaotic harmony, water swirling and spiraling at her feet as though forming a protective moat. The villagers froze, some dropping to their knees in trembling awe and fear, others backing away in a futile attempt to escape the inevitable. She did not shout, did not demand attention. The storm itself spoke, a living extension of her presence. The wind howled, carrying the echoes of her pain and the memory of their betrayal. The rain lashed down with renewed intensity, striking the rooftops and streets, vibrating with the energy of her wrath. For the first time, the villagers truly saw her, not as a helpless girl abandoned in the storm, but as a force they could neither comprehend nor resist. Every flash of lightning illuminated her crown, every gust of wind accentuated her authority, every swirl of water reinforced her supernatural connection to the elements. She had returned to claim what was hers, to be acknowledged not as a victim but as the embodiment of justice carried by the storm itself. Fear radiated through the village like an invisible current, as the reality of her power and the scope of her wrath became unmistakable. She was unstoppable, crowned by rain, and the storm obeyed her in every heartbeat, every step, and every breath. The storm had reached its peak. The rain, once a steady drum against roofs and leaves, now fell in sheets so thick it blurred the edges of the village, transforming familiar paths into rivers and streets into torrents. The crown of rain above her head pulsed with light, each droplet a shard of energy, reflecting lightning in a dazzling, almost divine display. Water swirled around her feet like a living entity, obeying her will with a fluid precision. The villagers who had abandoned, mocked, and betrayed her now stood frozen, staring at her with faces pale and drenched, eyes wide with disbelief and terror. They had never imagined the girl they had wronged could return wielding such unstoppable force. She raised her arms slowly, deliberately, and the storm responded immediately. Sheets of rain bent and twisted in the air, forming arcs and spirals that seemed guided by invisible hands. The wind screamed with fury, carrying branches and debris that crashed into walls and fences, demolishing obstacles and creating chaos. Thunder rolled like drums of war, echoing across the village and rattling the trembling houses. Her wrath had become tangible, no longer a feeling but a force of nature, channeling every ounce of her pain, betrayal, and rage into the storm that now obeyed her commands without hesitation. Lightning forked across the sky, striking the ground with explosive force. The earth shuddered, cracks forming along muddy streets as water surged upward, forming geysers and streams that swept away anything in their path. Her tormentors tried to flee, but the flood was faster, stronger, and relentless. Streets overflowed instantly, the force of the rushing water tearing fences from their posts, lifting planks and debris that collided violently with the walls of homes. The villagers screamed, their voices barely audible over the roar of the storm, panic rising in chaotic waves. Mothers called for children, husbands for wives, but the currents had no mercy, carrying the guilty and frightened alike in swirling, whirling torrents that mirrored the unrelenting justice being delivered. The crown above her head glowed brighter with each act of destruction, a symbol of the power she now commanded. Droplets fell like arrows, striking roofs, doors, and the surfaces of the fleeing villagers with pinpoint precision. Trees bent under the force of wind and water, their branches whipping into those who had wronged her, each strike a messenger of supernatural retribution. The river that had long bordered the village broke its banks, spilling over, the floodwaters now rushing through every street, alley, and courtyard. Those who had once laughed at her suffering now flailed in terror, slipping in mud and water, grasping at walls, fences, anything to hold on to, but nothing could halt the relentless advance of her wrath. Her eyes, glowing faintly beneath the storm's brilliance, scanned the chaos with calm purpose. The fury she had carried for so long had been honed and amplified by the storm. With a thought, she directed torrents of water toward those hiding in doorways, lifting them off their feet and spinning them helplessly in the raging current. Their screams filled the night, mingling with the thunder and the wind in a terrifying symphony. She did not strike personally, her presence and her command of the storm were enough. Water surged and twisted around them like serpents, wrapping around bodies, tearing them from the ground, pulling them into the flood's unstoppable flow. Lightning illuminated the horror in vivid, unbearable detail. Villagers' faces contorted in terror, their eyes wide with disbelief and fear as they were swept away. Roofs and walls crumbled under the combined force of wind and water, debris colliding with anyone caught in its path. The young woman, crowned by rain, moved slowly through the center of the village, her form serene amidst the chaos, every motion commanding obedience from the storm. Streams of rain bent toward her, carving channels that amplified the force of the flood, ensuring that the guilty could not escape the reckoning she had wrought. Branches snapped and were hurled with devastating precision. Water pooled and churned, forming eddies and whirlpools that dragged those who struggled beneath its surface. The storm had become both shield and weapon, protecting her while punishing the wicked. The screams of her enemies echoed across the village, mingling with the roar of the wind and the relentless crash of water. She watched as the very ground betrayed them, as if the earth itself recognized the righteousness of her vengeance. Even the birds and animals fled, sensing the supernatural force that had been unleashed, leaving the village empty except for the unrelenting storm and the wrath it carried. The crown of rain glimmered above her head, droplets circling in hypnotic patterns, lightning striking in sync with her heartbeat. Her wrath had become absolute, and the villagers who had wronged her were utterly powerless against the flood. Every attempt to flee, to hide, or to plead was swept away by the relentless deluge. Their homes were no longer sanctuaries but cages being torn apart, the water ripping through walls, flooding interiors and dragging possessions into the torrent. It was not random destruction. It was precise, deliberate, a supernatural manifestation of the justice they had evaded for so long. By the climax of the storm, the village was transformed. Streets were rivers, homes were shattered husks, and the people who had scorned her were either carried away or trembling in fear, completely at the mercy of the force she now embodied. The rain fell in sheets, her crown alight above her head, commanding every drop, every gust of wind, every flash of lightning. She had become inseparable from the storm, her anguish and wrath merged into a single, unstoppable power. As she stood there, drenched but unbowed, the full scope of her vengeance was evident. The storm had crowned her queen of its fury, and those who had wronged her were utterly undone, drowned by the force of a wrath they had never imagined could exist. The village slowly began to rebuild in the weeks and months after the storm, but no one ever forgot the night of the deluge. The houses that had been spared carried deep scars, streets remained scarred by torrents, and the forests around the village still whispered with the echoes of that fateful night. Elders would gather children around, pointing toward the darkened skies when storms approached, and recount the tale of the girl left in the rain. They spoke of her kindness, her suffering, and the vengeance she had summoned, not out of malice, but as the righteous wrath of one who had been wronged. Each telling grew more vivid, more awe-inspiring, until the story itself seemed imbued with the power of the storm. The Rain Queen, as she came to be known, was not merely a girl but a force of nature. Villagers recounted how her crown of rain had shimmered with lightning, how torrents of water had obeyed her every command, and how her eyes glowed with supernatural fire. She had walked into the village soaked and trembling, yet commanding every drop, every gust, and every flash of thunder. In the retellings, her presence was larger than life. Not just a person but a living embodiment of justice, sorrow transformed into unstoppable power. Children would shiver in awe and fear as they imagined the swirling waters, the eddies of rain at her feet, and the lightning flashing across her crown, carrying her wrath to every corner of the village. The moral of the story became ingrained in the culture. Villagers learned to respect the innocent, understanding that cruelty and envy could awaken forces beyond human comprehension. They whispered warnings about mocking the weak, abandoning the forsaken, or betraying trust, knowing that the Rain Queen's power was a lesson etched in both memory and legend. Each generation passed the tale down with reverence, embellishing details yet never forgetting the core truth. The innocent may endure suffering, but the elements themselves could rise to punish those who wielded cruelty. Over time, the story transcended the village, traveling to neighboring regions through traders, travelers, and wandering storytellers. Every retelling added new flourishes, the crown of rain gleaming brighter, the storm more fearsome, the girl herself more commanding. Yet at its heart, the legend remained a cautionary tale, emphasizing that suffering endured unjustly could transform into formidable power, and that nature could answer injustice with its own terrifying form of retribution. It reminded people that envy, cruelty, and betrayal were not harmless human traits. They carried consequences that could reach beyond mortal understanding. Even when storms approached the village, the people would pause and glance toward the skies, half in fear, half in respect, murmuring that the Rain Queen was watching. They spoke of seeing the shimmer of her crown in the rain, a fleeting glimpse that reminded them of the night she had returned to claim justice. Parents would teach their children to honor kindness and humility, to avoid envy, and to protect the innocent, invoking her name as both protector and judge. The Rain Queen became a symbol of resilience and righteous power, proof that even the most vulnerable could rise to command forces beyond imagination. In art and ritual, her memory endured. Villagers would mark the beginning of the rainy season with small offerings, lighting fires under the open sky, singing songs of the girl who had been left to the storm but returned crowned by it. The story was no longer just a tale of fear. It became a lesson in morality, a reminder that power could emerge from suffering, and that injustice, if left unchecked, could awaken forces that even the strongest could not resist. The Rain Queen had transcended mortality. She had become an enduring emblem of nature's ability to protect the innocent and punish the wicked. Through centuries, the legend remained alive, passed down from parent to child, elder to youth. The village and surrounding lands carried the memory in both spoken tales and in the collective respect for the storms that swept through. The Rain Queen was always there in the whispers of the wind, the flash of lightning, and the relentless pour of rain, a reminder that cruelty could not erase justice, and that those who inflicted suffering upon the innocent might one day find the elements themselves rising to claim retribution.